September 26th, 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with something heavier. The kind of weight that came before you did something you couldn't undo. That morning, at Port Moresby, the men of the 126th Infantry Regiment, part of the 32nd Red Arrow Division, stood lined up beside their packs and rifles. Their uniforms were already dark with sweat. Their boots, stiff and new, weren't made for what waited ahead. They'd been told the mission was simple. Cross the mountains, reach the north coast, join the Marines at Buna, drive the Japanese back into the sea. But when Sergeant William Bill Larson from Michigan's Upper Peninsula looked toward the horizon, he saw no road, just the endless, jagged green wall of the Owen Stanley Range. Mountains so tall they tore clouds in half. Someone in the ranks whispered, "They call it the Ghost Mountain." Someone else muttered, "Then we're the ghosts." And in a way they already were. The order had come from far away. From generals sitting at wooden desks with clean shirts and maps that looked simple. To them the mountains were just lines and names, Kokoda, Miola, Buna, but to the men standing in the mud it was something else entirely. A living wall of jungle and fog. The kind of place that swallowed sound, direction, and men. Major Boone, the unit commander, gathered them for a briefing. His voice was calm, but even he couldn't hide the strain. "Listen up, boys. Command says the Japs don't expect anyone to come over those peaks. That's our advantage. We'll surprise them, take them from behind. Supplies will be dropped by air along the way." A private asked, "Sir, how long's the trail?" Boone hesitated. "About 100 miles, maybe more. Depends on what the map doesn't show." Another voice from the back. "Sir, who mapped it?" Boone sighed. "Missionaries, before the war." A low murmur rippled through the group. Maps drawn by missionaries, mountains no one had crossed in years, rain that never stopped. Still, orders were orders. Sergeant Larson shouldered his rifle and turned to his squad, a mix of farmhands, lumberjacks, and clerks from Wisconsin and Michigan. They were young. Most had never been outside the States before the war. Private Eddie Haynes, a logger from Rhinelander, grinned through the sweat. "You think they'll have deer up there, Sarge?" Larson smirked. "If they do, they'll be hunting us." Behind them, Corporal Jimmy Myers, barely 20, adjusted his helmet and muttered, "They should have sent mountain climbers. We're just guardsmen." Larson nodded quietly. "That's why we'll make it. We don't know when to quit." They began the march at dawn. The trail was a narrow slit between towering trees, roots twisted like ropes across the mud. Within an hour, their uniforms were soaked through with sweat and rain. The jungle pressed in from all sides. Vines, insects, leaves the size of shovels. The air buzzed constantly. Mosquitoes swarmed their faces and necks. Every breath felt like breathing through a wet rag. By noon, they'd climbed the first ridge. Only 1,000 feet, but it felt like 10. When they stopped to rest, Larson watched the mist crawl up from the valley below like smoke. Eddie collapsed beside him. "We even sure this trail goes anywhere?" Larson wiped his forehead. "If it doesn't, we'll make our own." That night, they camped beneath a tangled canopy. Rain hammered the leaves above, turning the ground to soup. They built fires that barely stayed lit, their smoke swallowed by the fog. Larson sat under his poncho, writing in a small notebook, something he hadn't told the others he kept. His pencil scratched weakly against the damp paper. September 26, 1942. We started the climb today. The men are in good spirits, though none of us really understand what's ahead. The jungle feels alive, not friendly, not angry, just watching. It's strange to think this is war. There are no enemy lines, no trenches, just this green wall, and us walking into it. He closed the notebook and tucked it into his shirt. By the second day, the trail disappeared entirely. They hacked through the brush with machetes, every swing slower than the last. The rain didn't stop. It came down in sheets so heavy it blurred the world into shades of green and grey. At one point, Larsen stopped and looked back. The men were silent, bent under their packs, faces pale. Eddie stumbled and fell to his knees. Can't see where we're going." Larsen pulled him up. "Keep moving. The only way out is forward." By the third day, the rations were running low. The supply plane had flown overhead that morning, but the drop disappeared somewhere in the jungle canopy, swallowed by trees 100 feet tall. The men searched for hours but found nothing. When they regrouped, Myers said quietly, "We're running on 1 meal a day, Sarge." Larsen nodded. "Then make it last." They boiled muddy water in helmets, filtered it through shirts. It still tasted like rust and leaves. They chewed roots that made their tongues burn, and sometimes, when lucky, caught frogs. At night, fever crept through the camp. Malaria. Men shook in their blankets, whispering home addresses into the dark. Larsen's squad moved slower now, each step a small battle. The mud grabbed their boots like hands. Leeches clung to their legs, their rifles rusted in their hands. And, still, no sign of the enemy. The jungle didn't need an army to fight for it. It was the enemy. By the end of the first week, they reached a ridge so steep they had to pull themselves up by vines. The rain made the rocks slick, and more than once someone slipped, crashing down into the brush below. At the top, Larsen looked out. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks lost in clouds. Behind him, Myers coughed weakly. "You think the Japanese even know we're coming?" Larsen shook his head. "If they do, they'll never believe we made it this far." He looked at his men, exhausted, hungry, but still standing. Somewhere deep inside, a small spark of pride burned through the fatigue. Maybe they weren't elite soldiers. Maybe they were just guardsmen and farmers, but they were here, alive, on Ghost Mountain. And that, Larsen thought, was a victory all its own. That night, the rain stopped for the first time. The stars came out, faint and far between, but enough to see the outlines of the mountains around them. Larsen sat awake, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He could hear frogs calling in the valleys and the distant rush of water, a river they couldn't yet reach. He opened his notebook again. October 3rd, 1942, still alive. The men call these the Ghost Mountains. If we don't make it through, maybe that's what we'll become. But we'll keep moving, not for glory, not even for orders, just because stopping isn't an option anymore. And the ghosts were still climbing. October 10th, 1942, deep in the Owen Stanley Range, New Guinea. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the Ghost Mountain boys left Port Moresby. The jungle had stripped away everything, their rations, their strength, even their sense of time. Days and nights blended together in the endless grey-green blur of rain, mud, and exhaustion. The air was thick with the sour smell of wet clothes and fever. He sat up, his back aching, and looked around the small camp they had carved out of the hillside. The men were shadows now, their faces thin, eyes sunk deep, uniforms hanging loose. Every movement looked painful. Private Eddie Haynes, the logger from Wisconsin, sat by the fire, trying to light it with shaking hands. The wood was too wet. Smoke sputtered, then vanished. "Rain started again," Eddie muttered, his voice flat. "Ain't stopped since we got here." Larsen nodded quietly. "The mountain doesn't want us here." Eddie gave a weak grin. "Then it'll have to swallow us whole." By now, the trail, if it ever existed, had vanished. The platoon climbed through gullies filled with leeches, slid down mudslides that sent men tumbling like stones, Boots tore apart, socks dissolved, feet bled and swelled from blisters and fungus. Every hour the mountain took something. They lost Private Wilson to a fall. He'd stepped on what looked like solid ground, only for the earth to give way. The jungle swallowed him before anyone could reach. The sound of his scream was cut off by the roar of a waterfall far below. No one said a word. They just kept walking. Larsen carried the map, a damp sheet that no longer resembled the world around them. Rivers had changed course. Trails were gone. Every bend looked like the last. He stopped often to orient himself, staring through fog so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. Corporal Jimmy Myers stood beside him, pale and coughing. "Sarge, I think we've gone in circles." Larsen looked around. He couldn't deny it. The same twisted tree, the same slope. He sighed. "We keep heading north. The coast's that way." Jimmy frowned. "And if we're wrong?" Larsen looked him in the eye. "Then we'll find a new north." That afternoon, the rain turned violent. Thunder shook the valley. Sheets of water poured down the slopes, turning paths into rivers. The men moved single file, gripping vines to keep from sliding. Every step was a fight against the current. "Hold the line!" Larsen shouted over the roar. "Don't spread out!" But the jungle didn't care about orders. A flash flood came roaring down from above, a wall of brown water and branches. He looked at the men huddled together, some asleep, some awake, but staring into nothing. He took out his small notebook again, shielding it from the drizzle. October 10th, 1942, the mountain takes men quietly. No battle, no bullets, just mud and fever and silence. Command doesn't know what this place is. The air itself feels thick with something ancient, like it's warning us to turn back. But we can't. Buna's ahead, and the boys there are waiting. If we don't make it, they fight alone. He paused, tapping the pencil against the wet page. He thought of home, the cold wind off Lake Superior, his father's sawmill, the smell of pine instead of rot. He closed the notebook, staring into the darkness. The next morning, a new sound drifted through the mist. Engines. For the first time in days, hope. The men stumbled out of the trees, looking up. A small American C-47 transport plane circled overhead. Larsen waved his helmet, shouting, "Over here!" The plane dipped its wings, then banked low. Supplies tumbled out, crates attached to parachutes. The men cheered weakly, stumbling toward the drop zone. But the jungle wasn't done with them. Half the crates landed in the trees, tangled high above. One parachute tore, its crate shattering on the rocks below. When they opened the remaining boxes, half were useless. Soaked rations, broken medicine bottles. Still they ate what they could. Damp biscuits, moldy chocolate, anything to fill their stomachs. For the first time in days, someone laughed. Eddie grinned through cracked lips. "Guess it's dinner for kings tonight." Larsen smiled back. "Then eat like one. Might be our last good meal for a while." By the third week, they were ghosts, moving shadows through the jungle mist, their faces hollow, their eyes unfocused. Some men started talking to people who weren't there. One soldier, delirious from fever, saluted a tree and called it General MacArthur. Larsen did what he could, pushed them forward, one ridge at a time. But he could feel himself fading too. His feet were raw, his hands shook. Every night the fever whispered to him, "Lie down, just rest a minute." He refused. Then one morning the jungle opened. They stumbled onto a ridge and for the first time saw the sea, a thin blue line on the horizon. The men just stood there, silent. Some laughed. Some cried. Eddie fell to his knees. "We made it, Sarge. We actually made it." Larsen smiled weakly. "Not yet, but close." Behind them, the fog rolled over the peaks. A as if the mountain were closing its gates. He looked at his men, what was left of them. 28 started the climb. Barely half remained. They weren't soldiers anymore, they were survivors. That night, they camped near a river. For the first time, the sky was clear, stars burning bright above the canopy. Larsen wrote one last note before sleep took him. October 18th, 1942, we saw the ocean today. The mountain tried to eat us, but we're still here. The boys are thin as shadows. I don't know if Command even remembers we're out here, but if we make it to Buna, maybe someone will. Maybe someone will know what it cost to cross the ghost mountain. He closed the notebook, his hands trembling. He looked up at the stars, and for a moment they looked like home. The jungle whispered softly around them, not angry anymore, just quiet. October 24th, 1942, northern slopes of the Owen Stanley Mountains, New Guinea, the jungle had begun to thin. The endless wall of green softened into lighter patches of grass and palm. The air smelled different, salt and heat instead of rot and rain. Sergeant Bill Larsen could feel it in his bones. They were finally descending. The platoon moved slowly, one cautious step at a time. Their boots, once black, were now pale grey with salt and mud. Their uniforms clung to their bones. They looked like ghosts in the mist, hollow faces, eyes that had seen too much. Every few minutes Larsen would glance behind him. He counted the men again and again, afraid one might simply vanish between the trees. Eddie Haynes, the logger from Wisconsin, trudged beside him. His beard was patchy, his lips cracked, but his grin was still there. "Smell that, Sarge?" he said softly. "That's the ocean, I swear it." Larsen nodded, too tired to smile. "Then we're close." Eddie squinted at the horizon. "Never thought I'd be happy to see more water." The descent was cruel. What looked like smooth slopes turned into slick ravines. Rope bridges made from vines swayed above deep gullies. More than once, someone slipped and had to be dragged up by the others. Their stomachs groaned from hunger. The rations were long gone. Now they chewed wild roots and a bitter fern the natives had shown them could be eaten raw. Private Myers found a stream. They filled their canteens, but the water was cloudy. They drank anyway. Larsen said nothing. He'd stopped warning them weeks ago. There was no clean water left in the world, only water that didn't kill you right away. By midday, the rain stopped. Sunlight, sharp and white, cut through the canopy. It hurt their eyes. They stumbled into a clearing and froze. Ahead lay a small native village. Dozens of thatched huts sat beside the river. Smoke rose gently from fires. The villagers stared in silence. They had never seen such men before, thin, pale, covered in sores, faces hidden behind weeks of beard and dirt. For a moment, no one moved. Then an old man stepped forward, his hands raised in peace. Larsen lowered his rifle. "We're not here to fight." The man nodded slowly, then pointed to the men's boots, their wounds, their empty packs. He motioned toward one of the huts. The soldiers followed, too weak to argue. Inside they were given food, rice, roasted yams, and a thin soup that smelled like herbs and smoke. They ate in silence, their hands trembling as they lifted the bowls. Some wept quietly. Eddie leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. "Tastes better than anything I've ever had." Larsen smiled faintly. "That's because it's not mud." That night, they slept on dry ground for the first time in weeks. No rain, no leeches, just the soft hum of the jungle and the distant crash of waves. Larsen lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that they decrossed into another world, a quieter one, untouched by war. Still, he knew they couldn't stay. They had a mission to finish. Buna was waiting. He whispered to himself. We didn't come this far to stop now. The next morning, they said goodbye to the villagers. The old man pressed his hand to Larsen's chest, then pointed north. Buna, he said in broken English. 2 sons. 2 days, Larsen repeated, nodding. He thanked the man with a tired salute. The platoon marched out, slower than ever, but with a flicker of hope. They could see the ocean now, glinting blue through the palms. The smell of salt filled the air. They were so close they could almost taste it. By the second afternoon, they reached the coast. The beach stretched for miles, empty and silent, except for the sound of waves. Larsen fell to his knees in the sand. He scooped up a handful, letting it run through his fingers. Eddie dropped beside him. We made it, Sarge, Larsen nodded. Yeah, we made it. The others collapsed around them, too tired to move. They just sat there, staring at the horizon. For a few moments there was peace. No gunfire, no planes. Just the sound of the sea and the wind through the palms. Then, faintly, from the distance, the rumble of artillery. Buna. The men looked at each other. The war hadn't gone away. It was just waiting for them on the other side of the water. That night, they made a small fire from driftwood. The flames flickered weakly in the sea breeze. Larsen took out his notebook. The pages were nearly destroyed, the ink blurred, the paper soft from moisture. He wrote slowly, his hands trembling. October 24th, 1942, we've reached the coast. The ocean looks like home, but the guns remind us it's not over. 20 men left. We started with 50. The mountain took half of us. Fever took more. But somehow, we're still walking. Tomorrow, we move toward Buna. The ghosts aren't done yet. He closed the book, tucking it into his shirt. Eddie sat beside him, staring into the fire. Think anyone will believe what we went through? Larsen looked at him. Doesn't matter if they do. What matters is we made it. Eddie nodded. Still feels like a dream. Larsen smiled faintly. Then let's hope we don't wake up in the jungle. As the fire burned low, the men drifted to sleep. The surf whispered softly, a lullaby for the half-dead. Larsen stayed awake, watching the horizon. The stars above were sharp and bright. Somewhere beyond that black water, America waited, far away, almost unreal. He didn't know if they'd ever see it again. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something like peace. The wind carried the smell of salt and smoke. The ocean gleamed like silver. And in that quiet moment, the Ghost Mountain boys, what was left of them, finally rested. November 16, 1942, near Buna, northern coast of New Guinea. The jungle met the sea at Buna, thick, green, and endless. It looked peaceful from a distance, but inside that jungle was death. For weeks the Japanese had dug in. Bunkers made from palm logs, trenches hidden under the roots, machine guns aimed at every clearing. And into that wall of fire, the men who had crossed the mountains now arrived, starved, sick, but still standing. Sergeant Bill Larsen stared at the horizon. Smoke rose in the distance, thin and grey. That was Buna, their destination, their purpose. He turned to his men. They were down to 19 now. Fever had taken one more during the night. The survivors stood quietly, rifles slung, eyes sunken but alive. Behind them, the ocean shimmered. Ahead, gunfire. Larsen took a breath. We've come this far. We don't stop now. We move with the Australians. Our job is to mark the Japanese line so the artillery knows where to hit. Understand? No one answered, but they all nodded. Words didn't mean much anymore. The attack began before dawn. Rain drizzled softly as they crept through the trees, the mud sucking at their boots. The air smelled of salt and smoke. Then came the first shot. a crack that echoed through the palms. It was followed by machine gun fire. Short, sharp bursts that cut the silence like knives. The men hit the ground. Bullets tore through leaves above them. Eddie Haynes crawled beside Larson. "They've got the whole beach covered." Larson pressed his face into the mud. "Keep low! Move when they reload!" They inched forward, 1 foot at a time, sliding through the swamp. The Japanese had built nests of machine guns in the roots of fallen trees. Each time one fired, the flashes lit the shadows like lightning. The air was thick with smoke, rain, and the sickly sweet smell of gunpowder. Hours passed in chaos. The men moved from cover to cover, firing short bursts, marking positions with red smoke grenades. When the artillery finally came, the sky exploded. Shells whistled overhead, then crashed into the jungle ahead. Palm trees shattered. The ground shook. Larson shouted over the noise, "Hold the line! Keep that smoke up!" Eddie coughed through the haze. "Feels like the mountain again," Larson shouted back. "At least this one shoots back." By midday, the firing slowed. The air was thick and heavy, too quiet. Larson crawled forward, peering through the smoke. The enemy bunkers were in ruins, but the silence didn't feel right. He signaled the others to stay put. As he moved closer, a burst of gunfire erupted from beneath a pile of broken logs. A hidden machine gun opened fire, cutting across the clearing. Larson dove behind a fallen tree. Eddie shouted, "We've got one alive in there!" Larson yelled, "Suppress it!" The men fired, short bursts into the bunker, until the gun went silent. Then they waited. No movement. When the smoke cleared, Larson crawled forward again. Inside the bunker lay 2 Japanese soldiers, their uniforms black with mud and blood. One of them was barely breathing. Larson stared for a long moment. He looked young, maybe 18. He was clutching a photo of his family. Larson felt a cold ache in his chest. He reached down, gently closed the soldier's eyes and whispered, "It's over." By nightfall, the field was quiet again. The battle for Buna had begun, and it would not end quickly. The Allied lines were thin, supplies low, the men sick. The Ghost Mountain boys dug shallow trenches near the beach, sharing their last rations. A few crumbs of hard biscuit, some tinned meat that smelled half-rotten. Larson sat against a tree, writing in his notebook by the faint light of a shell flare, still burning in the distance. November 16th, 1942, we reached Buna. The mountain didn't kill us, but this place might. We're half an army, half alive. But the boys fight like ghosts, silent, pale, unstoppable. We're not here to win glory. We're here to make sure the next wave makes it through. He stopped, listening to the faint sound of waves against the shore. The ocean looked calm, hiding the wreckage of boats and bodies that had drifted in. Eddie sat beside him, chewing a piece of dried fruit he'd been saving for days. He offered some to Larson. Larson shook his head. "You keep it." Eddie smiled faintly. "You know, Sarge, when this is over, I'm never camping again." Larson laughed quietly. The first real laugh in weeks. "Yeah, I'll stick to fishing, fresh air, clean water, no leeches." Eddie smirked. "And no mountains." In the following days, the men continued to fight, not in grand charges or glorious assaults, but in slow, brutal crawls through mud and mangrove. Each bunker taken was a small miracle. Each man lost was another wound they couldn't afford. Malaria spread through the ranks, dysentery followed. Still they held. They fought for each other now, not for medals, not even for victory, just to keep the man next to them alive one more day. One evening, a radio crackled to life. A message from the front. The Japanese line was collapsing. Reinforcements were landing. The Americans and Australians had broken through. The men sat in silence, too tired to cheer. Larson closed his notebook and whispered, We did it. Eddie looked up. You think anyone back home will know what happened here? Larson shook his head slowly. Maybe not. But history doesn't forget everything. He stared out toward the same sea they had fought so hard to reach. The wind blew softly through the palms, carrying the smell of smoke and salt. He thought of the men they had lost in the mountains, of the faces that would never see home again. He whispered their names under his breath. The jungle answered only with silence. As the sun set, the survivors sat together near the shore. The water reflected the fading light like molten gold. For the first time since they'd left Port Moresby, they weren't moving. They had done their part. The mission, impossible from the start, had somehow been completed. Larson looked at his men, thin, broken, but alive. He said quietly, "We crossed a mountain that was never meant to be crossed, and we didn't just survive, we changed the fight." No one replied, but in the quiet, every man understood. They weren't just soldiers anymore, they were the ghost mountain boys, the ones who came out of the jungle when no one thought they would. Subscribe for more videos.